The Boy Who Painted Christ Black by John Heinrich Clark. He was the smartest boy in the Muscogee County School for the colored children. Everybody remotely connected with the school knew this. The teacher always pronounced his name with profound gusto as she pointed him out as the ideal student. I once heard her say if he were white, he might someday become president. Only Aaron Crawford wasn't white. Quite the contrary. His skin was so solid black that it glowed, reflecting an inner virtue that was strange and beyond my comprehension. In many ways, he looked like something that was awkwardly put together. Both his nose and his lips seemed a trifle too large for his face. To say he was ugly would be unjust, and to say he was handsome would be a gross exaggeration. Truthfully, I could never make up my mind about him. Sometimes he looked like something out of a book of ancient history. Looked as if he was left over from that magnificent era before the machine age came and marred the earth's natural beauty. His great variety of talents often startled the teachers. This caused his classmates to look upon him with a mixed feeling of awe and envy. Before Thanksgiving, he always drew turkeys and pumpkins on the blackboard. On George Washington's birthday, he drew large American flags surrounded by little hatchets. It was these small masterpieces that made him the most talked about colored boy in Columbus, Georgia. The Negro principal of the Muscogee County School said he would someday be a great painter, like Henry O. Tanner. For the teacher's birthday, which fell about a week before commencement, Aaron Crawford painted the picture that caused an uproar and a turning point at the Muscogee County School. The moment he entered the room that morning, all eyes fell on him. Besides his torn book holder, he was carrying a large framed canvas wrapped in old newspaper. As he took his seat, the teacher's eyes followed his every motion. A curious wonderment mirrored in them, conflicting with the half-smile that wreathed her face. Aaron put his books down, then smiling broadly, advanced towards the teacher's desk. His alert eyes were so bright with joy that they were almost frightening. The children were leaning forward in their seats, staring greedily at him. A restless anticipation was growing. Already the teacher sensed that Aaron had a present for her. Still smiling, he placed it on her desk and began to help her unwrap it. As the last piece of paper fell from the large frame, the teacher jerked her hand away from it suddenly, her eyes flickering unbelievingly. Amidst the rigid tension, her heavy breathing was distinct and frightening. Temporarily, there was no other sound in the room. Aaron stood questioningly at her, and she moved her hand back to the present cautiously, as if it were a living thing with vicious characteristics. I'm sure it was the one thing she least expected. With a quick, involuntary movement, I rose from my desk. A series of submerged murmurs spread through the room, rising to a distinct monotone. The teacher turned towards the children, staring reproachfully. They did not move their eyes from the present that Aaron had brought her. It was a large picture of Christ, painted black. Aaron Crawford went back to his seat, a feeling of triumph reflected in his every movement. The teacher faced us. Her curious half-smile had blurred into a mild bewilderment. She searched the bright faces before her and started to smile again, occasionally stealing a quick glance at the large picture propped up on her desk, as though doing so were a forbidden amusement. Aaron, she spoke at last, a slight tinge of uncertainty in her tone. This is the most wonderful present. Thanks. I will treasure it. She paused, then went on speaking a trifle more coherent than before. Looks like you're going to be quite an artist. Suppose you came forward to tell the class how you came to paint this remarkable picture. When he rose to speak to explain about the picture, a hush fell tightly over the room, and the children gave him all their attention, something they rarely did for their teacher. He did not speak at first. He just stood there in front of the room, toying absently with his hands, observing his audience carefully like a great concert artist. "It was like this," he said, placing full emphasis on every word. "You see, my uncle, who lives in New York, teaches a class in Negro history at the YMCA. When he visited us last year, he was telling me about how many great black folks who have made history. He said black folks were once the most powerful people on earth. When I asked him about Christ, he said no one ever proved whether he was black or white. Somehow a feeling came over me that he was a black man, because he was so kind and forgiving, and kinder than I had ever seen white people be. So when I painted his picture, I couldn't help but paint it as I thought it was." The teacher, knowing nothing else to do under the prevailing circumstances, invited the children to rise from their seats and come forward so they can get a complete view of Aaron's unique piece of art. When I came close to the picture, I noticed it was painted with the kind of paint you get in 5 and 10-cent stores. Its shape was blurred slightly, as if someone had jarred the frame before the paint had time to dry. The eyes of Christ were so deep-set and sad, very much like those of Aaron's father, who was a deacon at the local Baptist church. This picture of Christ looked so much different from the one I saw hanging on the wall when I was in Sunday school. It looked more like a helpless Negro, pleading silently for mercy. For the next day, there was much talk about Aaron's picture. The school term ended the following week, and Aaron's picture, along with the best handwork done by the student that year, was on display in the assembly room. Naturally, Aaron's picture graced the place of honor. There was no bookwork to be done on commencement day, and the joy was rampant among the children. The girls in their brightly colored dresses gave the school the delightful air of spring awakening. In the middle of the day, the children were gathered in the small assembly. On this day, we were always favored with a visit from a man whom all teachers spoke with mixed esteem and fear. Professor Daniel, they called him, and they always pronounced his name with reverence. He was supervisor of all the city school, including those small and poorly equipped ones set aside for colored children. The great man arrived almost at the ends of our commencement exercises. On seeing him enter the hall, the children rose, bowed courteously, and sat down again, their eyes examining him as if he were a circus freak. He was a tall, white man with gray hair that made his lean face seem even paler than it actually was. His eyes were the clearest blue I had ever seen. They were the only lifelike things about him. As he made his way to the front of the room, the Negro principal, George Duval, was walking ahead of him, cautiously preventing anything from getting in his way. As he passed me, I heard the teachers, frightened, sucking in their breath, felt the tension tightening. A large chair was in the center of the rostrum. It had been daintily polished, and the janitor had laboriously recushioned its bottom. The supervisor went straight to it without being guided, knowing that this pretty splendor was reserved for him. Presently, the Negro principal introduced the distinguished guest, and he favored us with a short speech. It wasn't a very important speech. Almost at the end of it, I remember him saying something about how he wouldn't be surprised if one of us boys grew up to be a great colored man like Booker T. Washington. After he sat down, the school chorus sang 2 spirituals, and the girls in the 4th grade did an Indian folk dance. This brought the commencement program to an end. After this, the supervisor came down from the rostrum, his eyes tinged with curiosity, and began to view the array of handwork on display in front of the chapel. Suddenly his face underwent a strange rejuvenation. His clear blue eyes flickered in astonishment. He was looking at Aaron Crawford's picture and stood gazing fixedly at it, curious and undecided, as though it were a dangerous animal that would rise at any moment and spread destruction. We waited tensely for his next movement. The silence was almost suffocating. At last he twisted himself around and began to search the grim faces before him. The fiery glitter of his eyes abated slightly as they rested on the Negro principal, protestingly. "Who painted this sacrilegious nonsense?" he demanded sharply. "I painted it, sir." These were Aaron's words, spoken hesitantly. He wetted his lips timidly and looked at the supervisor, his eyes voicing a sad plea for understanding. He spoke again, this time more coherently. "The principal said a colored person have just as much right painting Jesus black as a white person have painting him white. And as he—" At this point he halted abruptly, as if to search for his next words. A strong tinge of bewilderment dimmed the glow of his solid black face. He stammered out a few more words, then stopped again. At last color had swelled some of the lifelessness out of his lean face. "Well, go on," he said enragedly. "I'm still listening." Aaron moved his lips pathetically, but no words passed them. His eyes wandered around the room, resting finally with an air of hope on the face of the Negro principal. After a moment, he jerked his face in another direction, regretfully, as if something he had said had betrayed an understanding between him and the principal. Presently, the principal stepped forward to defend the school's prize student. "I encouraged the boy in painting that picture," he said firmly, "and it was with my permission that he brought the picture into the school. I don't think the boy is so far wrong in painting Christ black. The artists of all other races have painted whatsoever God they worship to resemble themselves. I see no reason why we should be immune from that privilege. After all, Christ was born in that part of the world that had always been predominantly populated by colored people. There is a strong possibility that he could have been a Negro. But for the monstrous lull of heavy breathing, I would have sworn that his words had frozen everyone in that hall. I had never heard the principal speak too boldly to anyone, black or white." The supervisor swallowed dumbfoundedly. His face was aglow in silent rage. "Have you been teaching these children things like that?" he asked the Negro principal sternly. "I have been teaching them that their race has produced great kings and queens as well as slaves and serfs," the principal said. "The time is long overdue when we should let the world know that we erected and enjoyed the benefits of splendid civilization long before the people of Europe had written language." The supervisor coughed. His eyes bulged menacingly as he spoke. "You are not getting paid to teach such things in this school. I am demanding your resignation for overstepping your limits as principal." George Duval did not speak. A strong quiver swept over his sullen face. He resolved himself slowly and walked out of the room towards the office. The supervisor's eyes followed him until he was out of focus. Then he murmured under his breath, "There'll be a lot of fuss in this world if you start thinking that Christ is a nigger." Some of the teachers followed the principal out of the chapel, leaving the crestfallen children restless and in a quandary about what to do next. Finally, we started back to our rooms. The supervisor was behind me. I heard him murmur to himself, "Damn if niggers ain't getting smarter." A few days later, I heard the principal had accepted a summer job as art instructor in a small high school somewhere in South Georgia, and had gotten permission from Aaron's parents to take him along so he could continue to encourage him in his painting. I was on my way home when I saw him leaving his office. He was carrying a large briefcase and some books tucked under his arm. He had already said goodbye to all the teachers, and strangely, he did not look broken-hearted. As he headed for the large front door, he readjusted his horn-rimmed glasses, but did not look back. An air of triumph gave more dignity to his solitary stride. He had the appearance of a man who had done a great thing, something greater than any ordinary man would do. Aaron Crawford was waiting outside for him. They walked down the street together. He put his arms around Aaron's shoulders affectionately. He was talking sincerely about something, and Aaron was listening, deeply earnest. I watched them until they were so far down the street that their forms had begun to blur. Even from this distance, I could see that they were walking in brief, dignified strides, like two people who had won some sort of victory.